This podcast is brought to you by Rise Make Life Workout, a health and self-development platform dedicated to helping busy, everyday Kiwis manage their physical health and upskill their mental well-being.
Through sharing relatable and practical content from health practitioners, as well as showcasing interesting stories from interesting people.
For more shows, content, events, and coaching, head to our website, www.rise-workout.com.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Rise Optimize, where we make science simple to help you optimize your health. My name is Sinead Bierman, and today I'm joined by friend and physio Maisie Kilner.
Hi guys.
Welcome. It's been a while since we've recorded a Rise Optimize, and it's awesome to have you here today, Maisie, to be talking all about running form, running injuries, and how to prevent that where we can. So I guess first of all, being your first time on the Rise podcast, you can introduce yourself, let people know about you and a little bit about your background as well.
Okay, so as Sinead has introduced me as Maisie, and I've been living in New Zealand for 2 years, originally from the UK, as you can probably tell from my accent. I am a physio, so I'm working in a clinic, an MSK clinic in Auckland, and we see all kinds of athletes and non-athletes as well. Get to see quite a lot of runners, so naturally that's kind of where my interest has led, and my background in terms of running, I suppose I was never really a massive runner through school. Like, I wasn't really in the athletics team or track team or anything. I've always just done it for my own enjoyment, and I think the first real time that I decided to run a race was with my family back in 2013. We did a charity race called the Royal Parks Half in London, which is a really cool half marathon that runs through the Royal Parks, and we raised money for Cleft, so it was just a charity that we were raising money for. Did it with all my siblings and just loved it, loved the atmosphere. And then I remember going to see the London Marathon shortly after with my sister, and I was just like, oh, this is so cool, seeing everyone pushing themselves to their limits, and I was like, I'd love to do that one day. So entered the ballot and didn't get in, which most people don't, but then just entered it every year since 2013. I think it was like 2019. I'd entered it earlier in the year, completely forgot. I'd entered it and got a message from the London Marathon being like, wait, you're into the ballot. And I was like, oh gosh, okay, I better start training for this then. So I trained for my first marathon in 2019 and loved it. And so that just led me on to sign up to the next one and just kind of got the bug for doing different events. And more recently we ran from sort of one end to the Grand Canyon to the other end of the Grand Canyon, so North Rim to South Rim, which is a really fun sort of marathon, I guess, but more on trail. So yeah, it's just kind of bounced from one event to the next event, and have just kind of enjoyed the journey that that's taken me on.
I love that your first event was a half marathon with your family. Oh, not a little 5K fun run, just into it.
Yeah, and awesome. It's quite funny looking back on that now, because I really had no idea that was the beginning of my running journey, and I had no idea how to train. I just thought, I just have to like run the distance over and over again. So I'd probably run like 12 miles every weekend as my training. And now I know that obviously that's not the structure of a usual training plan, but yeah, it's been a good sort of learning journey from then.
Yeah. All right, we'll get into our first question, and that is there such thing as perfect running form, or is there a more ideal or optimal technique or style when it comes to running?
Yeah, so I think this is probably quite a hot topic online and on social media. There's quite a lot of people making quite sort of broad statements on how we should be running and what the perfect form is. But I think it's something to remember is that running is one of the most sort of basic, fundamental things that we as humans learn to do from a really young age. And given that we as humans are so different, it follows that we're going to have different running styles. And I think actually part of our individuality is something to celebrate and not necessarily all be striving for one kind of running style. I was watching the London Marathon last week and actually just looking at all of the top level athletes and all of their different running styles. Some of them look pretty uncomfortable, but they're still doing these 26.2 miles in like 2.5 hours, so obviously it can't be that bad. So yeah, I think there is a great variety of running styles, and there isn't one like cookie cutter thing that we should all be aiming for. And I think coming from like a physio lens, if you're comfortable and you're not getting injured from your running style, then that's probably optimal for you. We probably self-optimize our own gait based on comfort. However, I think there is certain sort of running features that crop up a lot in different kind of injuries. And probably the first one to mention is overstriding. So overstriding is when you're landing with your foot out in front of your centre of mass. So you tend to have an extended knee and your foot in dorsiflexion, so your foot is facing up towards you. So if you can imagine, if you're landing out in front of yourself, you've got increased kind of braking forces and ground reaction forces sort of travelling up through the ankle and the knee, and that's associated with more injuries. So one of the things that we tend to look at as physios is, are people overstriding? And then this is also associated with sort of a decreased step rate. So that's like your cadence in running. So anything below about 170 as a step rate, so that's 170 steps per minute, is seen to be like a low step rate. And researchers looked at increasing step rate in terms of load going through different structures. So increasing your step rate can reduce your peak Achilles load, your tibial load and plantar fascia load, which are some of the common injuries that we do see in running. But having said that, I'd say everyone will have a slightly different cadence, and probably it's only going to be beneficial to increase your cadence if you are having a problem with that and you've got a particularly low cadence to begin with. So yeah, I'd say that's probably one of the main things. The other thing that I know is quite a hot topic is rear foot versus forefoot strike. And I think historically people would associate sort of forefoot striking to be the better one, and I think probably it's because we see like sprinters, Usain Bolt, like that is your probably more pretty run to look at, and that's what we kind of all would be like, oh, that's the one that we want to go for. But actually most endurance athletes, 90% of endurance athletes are rear foot strikers, and actually it's been shown to be more efficient to be a rear foot striker if you are an endurance athlete. So I think trying to change your gait based on what you've seen in certain like sprinters is not necessarily going to be helpful, and there's pros and cons to both rear foot and forefoot striking. So rear foot striking, you're going to have more load through the knee and the hip, and forefoot more through the Achilles and the ankle. So you just kind of end up with different pros and cons to each of those foot strikes.
Yeah, I definitely notice that when you see sprinters or someone running, and it looks very elegant and effortless when they're like running along on their toes. But like you said, sometimes they're probably going for more speed in a shorter distance than someone that's doing a long run. And I guess as well, something that also comes down to exposure. Like if someone is accustomed to being a forefoot versus heel foot striker and accustomed to their particular pace as well, that'll all come into if they're likely to get injuries or not from that particular style.
Definitely. And I think you've always got to be a bit careful when you are trying to change your gait that you don't change anything too suddenly. Like I think we do see injured runners in the clinic, and I will do a gait analysis on them and see if there's anything that's like strikingly obvious to pick out about their gait and that might be contributing to increased load on their sensitive tissue. So for example, like a real valgus knee, which is when your knee is coming in towards the other knee, and if you were looking from behind you wouldn't see much of a gap between them, and that's been quite strongly linked to patellofemoral pain. So if a runner came in and they said, oh, I've got patellofemoral pain, and I looked and their knees were like knocking together, that may be something that we look to address with a little cue like, you know, don't let your knees touch when you're running. But if we are implementing that change, you'd want to do it really gradually, because you're then at risk of actually changing something too suddenly and loading up a different structure and ending up with a different injury. And so it's all very like individual, I suppose, and I think we've just got to be careful in the general population giving generic advice and then people trying to change to fit that gait, because it might actually end up being more
not applicable to that particular individual and could cause more issues down the track. So let's get into what are some of the common injuries or issues that people can experience when running, and what are likely some of the causes that would be causing those common problems.
So we see most of the stuff that we see in clinic would be an overuse injury. So I think in the literature it's reported between about 60 to 80% of running injuries are due to overuse rather than being necessarily a structural failure. It's just that you've overloaded a structure past its capacity, and then you'll end up with symptoms as a result. And when we think of running, you're putting 4 to 5 times your body weight through that foot each time. And so it's no surprise really that if we keep loading up in this kind of exponential way, that something's going to give and something's going to result in an injury. I always quite like the analogy of the scales. So you've got like capacity of your structures or your muscles and your tendons and your bones, and then you've got the load that you're putting on them, and that always needs to stay quite balanced. If your load exceeds the capacity, then you're going to end up with an injury. But on the flip, you've got to load them to increase the capacity as well. So it's kind of this juggling act all the time, making sure that we're loading enough but not overloading. And I'd say in terms of the most common injuries that we see, you've got kind of your bone stress injuries. So under that umbrella is like your shin splints, any like stress fractures. So a lot of like foot stress fractures or hip stress fractures or tibia, fibia, all of those kind of things. And then you've got your tendinopathies. So common ones for runners would be Achilles, gluteal tendinopathy, and proximal hamstring tendinopathy, patellofemoral pain, which is what we touched on before, which is the anterior knee pain between the patella joint and the femur, and iliotibial band syndrome is another common one we see, plantar fasciitis, and then sort of your muscle injuries, so a lot of calf strains or quad strains, and we see them a lot in people that have like taken up hills recently. But yeah, all of those that I've just kind of listed off fall under that kind of bracket of overuse injuries.
It's quite rare with running, for especially if someone's just sort of running on the flat, for those acute injuries. Like you would still maybe see rolling their ankle now and again, but like you said, a lot of the times it is more those overuse injuries from, and often sometimes from doing too much too soon or not being aware of that sort of load and capacity balance. So I guess it kind of answers the question itself, but what would be some of the ways to prevent those injuries from occurring?
Yeah, so in terms of injury prevention, I think it's a difficult one because you can't prevent every injury, and I looked at the stats earlier. I think it's about 50% of runners will get injured each year, and that's very high. And yeah, even like myself, I've had plenty of running injuries, and even though I should know the reasons why, like we still kind of end up with them. But I think you can definitely reduce your risk of getting injured by taking certain things into consideration. So one of the common things that I see when we kind of break down what people have been doing and like what kind of speeds they've been doing is that they're running every single run at a moderate to hard pace and not kind of having that difference between what a session is and where you're kind of wanting to get those higher heart rates and then the slower runs. So I think one of the top things is that you should be running slower to kind of build up your aerobic capacity and allow your body to kind of not be in a state of fatigue the whole time, and have a clear split between your faster runs and your slower runs. And there's that rule that a lot of people speak about, which is the 80-20 rule, which I think is quite a good sort of base to, if you're just starting out, to go with, which is that 80% of your training run should be easy. And by definition, easy would be something like a conversational pace, so you'd be able to run and have a chat, or a low heart rate, like maybe under 150, but again it's different for everyone. And then 20% of your workouts would be harder, so that's when you're really kind of like pushing the heart rate and the pace. And by kind of having that split, it allows you to have those really good quality sessions in that 20%, and then you're just recovering and taking it really easy in that 80%, rather than kind of sitting in the middle all the time and always having that kind of base of fatigue. That's a better way to kind of split your running. The other thing is considering what you call the acute on chronic workload. So that would be your chronic workload is what you've been doing over the past like 6 weeks, and then your acute workload is what you've been doing this week. So there is a ratio, I can't remember exactly what it is, but that should be kind of in balance. So you don't want to be suddenly peaking if you've not had a good base of chronic workload. And that tends to be why people that have been training for years, they can kind of cope with those changes a little bit better because they've got a nice chronic workload. Whereas if you're just starting out, you've not got a chronic workload, so you need to kind of build that up and then gradually increase your mileage like that. And then the last kind of point on that is recovery. So making sure that you're kind of factoring in your recovery is a big one for reducing injuries. And yeah, I've just written a note here that there's loads of gizmos out there in terms of recovery systems. I feel like my Instagram feed is just full of like your massage guns, your kind of boots that you wear, when really the number one like recovery tip would be sleep. So getting in your good sleep, and I think if people could sell sleep, there'd be like $1 million business out there. So that's our best kind of proven recovery tool, and again that's going to be key in preventing injuries.
Some very good tips. I especially like that acute on chronic workload, because that's very common when people, you know, they see a run event come up and they're like, oh, I'm going to do that, and it's only like 2 months away or 3 months away, and they're, I'm going to do the half marathon, sign me up. And so like you said, they're trying to build that workload and their capacity over a very short period of time, and then that's where usually injuries will prop up along the way, versus like you said, someone that's been running for a good couple of years and then they decide to do an event. It's not much extra that they have to kind of put onto their schedule in order to get ready for an event, but for someone that's going from no running to like, oh, I'm going to run a half marathon in a couple of months.
And I think the other thing with that, which we kind of forget as well, is if you're returning from a break of running, so you might be like, oh, I've ran for like 10 years, but actually I've recently had COVID, so I've been off, and then I went on a holiday, and so I haven't actually ran for the last 6 weeks. We can't just expect ourselves to go back to what we were doing 6 weeks ago. It's kind of, you've got to remember like what you've been doing recently is more important, and like that's your recent kind of chronic workload, and not have a big jump up. So yeah, when you're returning from a break or an injury, or like Christmas period, I think is a classic one with like athletes that are in college. They go away for Christmas and they come back and they go straight back into training, and that's when their injuries occur.
Yeah, it's getting used to that load again back on the body, especially something like running, like you said, with those slower runs. It's allowing your body to kind of get used to that load through the body again before you're sort of picking up the pace. So yeah, very good tips that people should be mindful of. Yeah, so anything else to add to that one?
So probably, I think the last one, which is pretty simple, is just listen to your body. Although I say that's simple, I think a lot of us do just ignore that, but definitely looking for signs of overtraining. So if you're feeling really fatigued and you wake up and you think, oh, like the last thing I feel like doing is going for a run, like have that extra rest day. If you're feeling sort of like you're not recovering as quickly, you know, your muscles are tired, you've got excessive fatigue, or you're getting sort of frequent infections. So I know when I know that I'm overtraining, I get like a sore throat. That's always the first thing for me to go. So it's just kind of knowing what your own signs are from your body of when you've done too much, and kind of knowing when to pare it back, because that could be the first sort of signs that you're running into an injury.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the body's always giving us signs, and if we don't sort of listen to those along the way, it's usually then we get an injury, and it's the big sign that will make us have to stop what we're doing to really slow down and think, oh, okay. And that's when we usually then hopefully reflect back and think, oh, okay, actually there probably was signs a couple of weeks ago that I was pushing my limits and pushing my boundaries.
And so I think it's sometimes hard, you confuse with like motivation versus what your body is telling you to do. Sometimes we're just like, oh no, like push through.
Yeah, I'm just being lazy. I just need to get up and get it done.
Need to get up and do it. Yeah. But actually, those signs, you're like, would I benefit more from taking a rest day and then having a way better session tomorrow when I'm feeling recovered, versus pushing through today and then probably being fatigued for the rest of the week. Yeah,
and it does just take a bit of time to get used to, like you said, is it just me trying to get out of this run because I can't be bothered and I want to sleep in, or am I actually feeling pretty fatigued and could do with the extra few hours? So any other, I guess, tips for maybe more so beginners, people that are wanting to get into running and they kind of have either seen runners or think, yep, you know what, I want to get into running, where do I start? What should I do?
So I think if you're keen to get into running, the best place to start is finding like a running group or something in the running community. There's so much out there in Auckland, especially. You've got like so many running clubs, you've got Neighbourhood, you've got Run for Auckland, and probably loads more that I'm just forgetting at the moment. But get involved in the running community. I think everyone's super welcoming. Park Run is another good one, 5Ks every Saturday, because that will give you kind of that external motivation, it'll give you support, you'll meet other runners who'll give you advice, and you might find a race to sign up to. So I think that's always a good place to kind of start when you are getting into running. And then just kind of, as we the overriding theme has been during this podcast is sort of keeping your volume really steady. So there's that kind of 10 to 20% rule when you are starting your running to only increase your overall mileage by like 10 to 20%. That rule does have limitations, especially when you're starting out and you've got those lower mileage. Like if you're just increasing 10% of 2k a week, it's going to take a very long time to build it up. But I think when you're kind of over that 20k mark, that's always a good kind of ballpark to go by. I think just the key thing is no kind of spike in your training load, whether that is you're running like your miles, but you've also got to think about your intensity, so like your hills, your speed, everything like that. Just no big jumps, so it's just sort of that progressive overload. I'd say not comparing yourself with others on Strava. I think that Strava's kind of become a little bit of a social media these days. Like I've had Strava probably for 10 years or so. I've had it like ever since I started running, and like I didn't even used to know that you'd follow people on Strava. I just had it for my own like benefit. And I think that is kind of how it should be used. But I feel like now people are using it to see what other people are running, what pace they're running. And I think sometimes you can get a bit carried away with that and try and be like, oh, I'm doing an easy run, but you know, I could actually make this pace look a bit better on Strava. Like, so don't try and be a hero on Strava, and don't compare yourself to others. You can make your account private and just kind of do your own thing. And trying to say if you have got a training program that you're running with, try and keep your mindset fairly flexible. Like we kind of spoke about before, have an extra rest day if you need it. Don't be too rigid with your training. Although I've talked a lot about kind of load on tissues. Like we aren't just tissues that are being loaded, like there's other things in our life like external stresses and sleep and work and other things. We're not all full-time athletes, so I think, you know, give yourself a day off if you need. Sometimes rest is best. And then the last thing I think is just don't overcomplicate it. I think one of the nice things about running is that you can do it anywhere with little equipment, so it doesn't need to always be paces and set times or recording it. Sometimes just go out and enjoy a run, go and explore a new place. So enjoy it. I think that's the last kind of tip for anyone that wants to start running. Yeah, no, I think they are great tips. It's common, I think people they can be a bit cautious as to where do I start, how do I start, so that's why I think a running community is great. But then once you're into it, it's I guess not getting then too competitive and caught up on what everyone else is doing, and reminding yourself that again everyone's going to have different things they're training for, so it might be for them they're training hard that day when it's your easy run, so you should be looking at someone thinking, oh, they're doing a 4-minute pace, I should be running faster, when it's you know, you're doing a recovery run. So and when you're saying don't overcomplicate it, I guess including shoes, like there's not a lot of great deal out there as to say what's the best running shoe. I think everyone has their own preference with running shoes. You know, you've got it's a minefield. I think looking for running shoes, there's so many different options out there, but I think the best thing to do is just to go into a running shop, get on a treadmill and try on the shoe and see what feels comfortable for you. Some running shops have a policy where you can go away for a week and try them out and see what they feel like. The only other thing with shoes, I suppose, is having a couple of pairs and rotating through them if you're doing kind of back-to-back running days, because the foam in the shoe needs to like re-expand. And I think in terms of injury rates, showing people that kind of change up their footwear and again aren't always loading in the same way, kind of changing up their footwear has been shown to kind of decrease injury rates as well. So that might just be something to consider, having a couple of pairs on the go, so you're not always running in one pair, and
they kind of last longer then. Whereas if you wear one out quite quickly, you might, again, that could be where injuries start to arise because you don't realise you've worn your shoes out so much. And then in saying that, when you get brand new shoes, again, that's going to take a while for your body to get accustomed to, so you can also have issues when you get a brand new pair. So if you've got two on the go, that you can kind of alternate so that they're not getting fully worn out and you're not having to get new ones all the time.
But I think with shoes it is just what feels comfortable for you. There's so many like carbon plates and bionic shoes out there, but I think just whatever feels good, what you feel good in and what you feel comfortable in is the best shoe for you.
Yeah, and within your budget. You don't need to be getting those
Exactly.
$300, $350 shoes to if you're just wanting to run a couple of casual runs each week. Yeah. If anyone has any more questions in regards to running, where can they find you, Maisie?
So you can find me on Instagram on Maisie Swim Bike Run, or you can message Shanae with any questions.
Yeah.
You should pass them on.
Sure thing. Awesome. Make sure you're following along at We Are Rise NZ on Instagram and Rise Make Life Workout on YouTube. We'll see you next time.